have seen this may have appeared wrong in the ethical sense, but Kierkegaard saw it as necessary if he was to follow the religious life. It's also not difficult to see dark echoes of his relationship with his father. At the last moment, God had stayed Abraham's hand so that Isaac was not sacrificed. Kierkegaard had been driven to the brink of spiritual extinction by his domineering father, who then died so that his son might turn into something. By the age of 30, Kierkegaard was devoting his life almost entirely to writing. He no longer saw his old student friends and lived a solitary existence. He emerged only for long walks through the streets of Copenhagen, where his increasingly eccentric appearance attracted attention. A thin, stooped figure in a top hat, he wore narrow trousers with one leg invariably shorter than the other. Always old beyond his years, he already seemed middle-aged. Occasionally he would stop and talk with young children. He would give them small presents, and they would cautiously delight in this strange little young old man's impish humour. On weekends, Kierkegaard would hire a coach and ride through the city gardens or into the countryside. He remained mindful of his status as the son of one of the city's richest merchants. But the Olsen family had been outraged at his behaviour toward their daughter Regine, and as a result he had been ostracized by polite society. On Sundays he attended church. Among the other members of the congregation he would frequently notice Regine, and she would notice him. They didn't speak, but they were well aware of each other. Although he had hurt her deeply, and hurt himself even more, there remained a hidden bond between them. For all his psychological self-probing and honesty, Kierkegaard continued to be curiously prone to delusion. He couldn't stop hoping that someday, somehow, he and Regine would be reunited, presumably in some kind of spiritual bond. Although he knew it was impossible, he couldn't help himself from longing for the impossible. His analysis of their relationship remained a constant preoccupation, and this only contributed to his ever-deepening self-knowledge. He became only too aware of the endless subterfuges that the mind plays upon itself. What had begun as a highly personal fiasco of inadequacy led him to see the universal inadequacies of human nature. Subjectivity itself was impossible, yet it had to be lived. Meanwhile, he continued to write obsessively. During the next 2 years, 1844 to 1846, he published half a dozen books under various pseudonyms, including Johannes Climacus, John the Climber, Vigilius Haufniensis, Watcher of the Dunghill, Hilarius Bookbinder, no hilarity here, alas, and Frater Taciturnus, an odd choice for an author with logorrhea. By now, much as he had hoped, the Copenhagen literati had begun to realize the true identity of this silently hilarious dunghill climber. Kierkegaard's ideas continued to develop at a pace similar to his literary output. His analysis of the notion of existence was to prove crucial in the later development of existentialism. For Kierkegaard, existence was a surd. In mathematics, a surd is a quantity that cannot be expressed in ordinary numbers, such as pi. For Kierkegaard, existence was all that was left after everything else had been analysed away. It was simply there. Kierkegaard compared it to a frog that you discover at the bottom of your beer mug when you've finished your beer. But when we come to examine our own existence, we discover it's more than just there. It has to be lived out. It has to be turned into action by means of subjective thought. This is the essential element of our subjectivity, and it leads to subjective truth. Here we see what Kierkegaard means when he asserts that subjectivity is truth. For Kierkegaard, there are 2 kinds of truth. Objective truth, such as the truths of history and science, are related to the external world. They can be confirmed by reference to outer criteria. In other words, objective truth depends upon what is said. Subjective truth, on the other hand, depends upon how a thing is said. Unlike objective truth, subjective truth has no objective criteria. Kierkegaard gives the example of 2 men at prayer. One is praying to the true conception of God, the Christian one for Kierkegaard, but is doing so in a false spirit. The second man is a pagan, praying to his primitive idol, but with an entire passion for the infinite. For Kierkegaard, it is the second man who has the greatest subjective truth, because he prays in truth. Kierkegaard's notion of subjective truth is akin to sincerity, only more so. It involves a passionate inward commitment. Subjective truths are the most important for Kierkegaard because they are fundamentally related to our existence. As we have seen, they are not related to any objective criteria. Instead, they are related to the TSUD that remains when all objective criteria have been analyzed away. Subjective truth is thus concerned with the very foundation of our values, not so much with whether these values are correct, but the nature of our commitment to them. According to this view, no morality can originate from objective fact. Curiously enough, here Kierkegaard allies himself with that profound atheist and skeptic, the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume. According to Hume, all we can know is what we experience. From this we derive so-called facts. But from these facts it is not possible to derive any morality. Just because sobriety is conducive to consistent behaviour, we cannot therefore say that we ought to remain sober. Both Kierkegaard and Hume agree that we cannot derive an ought from an is. This process, which attempts to include ethics in philosophy, is now known as the naturalistic fallacy. But Kierkegaard's belief in the superiority of subjective truth to objective truth caused him to doubt Hume's view concerning the primacy of fact. Kierkegaard rightly sees that even so-called facts can be determined by our attitude. To a considerable extent, our values determine the facts. Faced with the same reality, the Christian and the pleasure-seeker may see different facts, as for example if both were introduced to a bordello or a religious retreat. In this way, each individual is to a certain extent the creator of his own world, and he creates his world because of the values he holds. It is not difficult to see in such thinking the seeds of present-day relativism, with its rejection of the entire notion of objective truth. Kierkegaard also anticipates 20th century phenomenology, which sees all forms of consciousness as intentional. In other words, consciousness is always purposive. We see the world the way we do because of what we intend to do to it. Likewise, Wittgenstein's remark, "The world of the happy man is a different one from the world of the unhappy one," whose apparent banality takes on a more profound tenor when one realizes that he is speaking here of the exercise of the will. As Kierkegaard realized, the individual sees the world that he wills to see, and this depends upon the values he has previously chosen, the ones he lives by, the ones that make him what he is. Kierkegaard thus argues that the values that make the individual what he is also make the world what it is. This phenomenological point of view may hold true for the scientist who believes in science, whose world is different from the historian who believes in history, but it has serious drawbacks. The main drawback is the peril of solipsism. The view that I alone exist, that the world is all here for me. As Kierkegaard would have it, I alone am responsible for my world, that is, the world I inhabit. This was taken to its logical limits in the 20th century by the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre. While serving as a private in the French army in 1940, he felt he had to accept that the entire world war was his responsibility. Such sublime egoism, a feat possible only for a true intellectual, may be a moral tonic, but it is hardly conducive to a useful world view. But this was just the kind of moral tonic for which Kierkegaard was searching. His aim was to make existence as intense as possible. Only in this way do we see it as it is, see it for what it is, what it can be. Existence is a colossal risk. We can never know whether the way we choose to live is the right way. Anyone who realizes this fully, who makes himself constantly aware of it, is bound to feel anguish, according to Kierkegaard. Such subjective truths, supported by no objective evidence, are grounded on nothing, literally. We thus come to know the nothingness of existence, the utter uncertainty that lies at its heart. Life is fundamentally tentative and elusive. Even consciousness itself is a contradiction. This is the intersection of actuality and possibility, the meeting place of what is and what is not. As Kierkegaard also put it, life is understood backwards, but lived forwards. Consciousness is thus in opposition to itself. It is a doubleness. As Kierkegaard noted, the word double and doubt stem from the same root. They originate from duer, with doubt meaning two possibilities. Consciousness itself is a form of doubt. This undercuts even Descartes, the philosopher who doubted everything, but found in the end that he couldn't doubt he was doubting, that he was thinking in the first place. Yet Kierkegaard showed that consciousness, or conscious thought, far from being certain, is a form of doubt itself. How? Because in consciousness we doubt existence itself. But is this merely a case of the snake swallowing its tail? Here we are indeed in elusive territory, with the few concepts we have becoming ever more slippery. For instance, it's all very well saying that even consciousness is open to doubt, but can something that doesn't exist do anything at all, let alone doubt itself? Kierkegaard's defenders argue that he doesn't say consciousness doesn't exist, he merely doubts its existence. This is a vital point. What Kierkegaard is saying is that it is possible to doubt consciousness to bits. Once again, reverting to the skepticism of Hume, Kierkegaard saw that it is possible to question the continuity of consciousness. We don't experience this continuity from one moment to the next. All we experience is the moment, the present. Consciousness is thus utterly precarious. Once we become aware of this, existence becomes even more of a risk. And this is further emphasized when we bear in mind that we might die at any moment, a fact that we learn from experience as well as from our awareness of the absence of continuity in consciousness. Simultaneously, we should remain aware of the complete freedom that we have at every moment. We can choose anything. We can completely transform our lives. At every moment we are confronted with utter freedom. This is the true situation that faces us. As a result of this, when we are fully aware of the reality of our situation, we experience dread. Kierkegaard wrote an entire book about the concept of dread. This concept is often translated as anxiety or anguish, but is best conveyed by the German word Angst. I use the word that usually appears in the English title of Kierkegaard's work. The concept of dread is one of the most profound pre-Freudian works of psychology. In it, Kierkegaard distinguishes between two different types of dread. First is the dread we experience when we are threatened by an external object, such as a roaring lion. The second type of dread results from an inner experience, our confrontation with the limitless possibilities of our own freedom. When we become aware of this freedom, we understand its enormity and its irrationality. As Kierkegaard points out, it is impossible to prove that we have freedom, because this proof would involve logical necessity, which is the opposite of freedom. Freedom has nothing to do with philosophy. It is a psychological matter dependent upon our state of mind or attitude. Our state of mind makes us understand our freedom, and we realize our freedom to its fullest extent when we experience the state of mind called dread. In this sense, the individual doesn't exist as being at all. He exists only in a state of constant becoming. The dread which this induces is the terror that lies at the heart of all normality. To realize this fully plunges us into madness. According to Kierkegaard, the only way out of this is to take the equally irrational leap of faith. The individual is thus saved from this madness and disintegration by his subjective inwardness being related to God. Others may prefer to evade this situation by belief in the illusion of everyday reality, where such deranging freedom is cunningly disguised by the demands of normality. But is this awareness of our essential freedom really enough to waken in us such an awful feeling of dread? Or are only geniuses like Kierkegaard and Kafka capable of walking around in a constant state of dread at the possibilities of their own existence? Perhaps, but we mediocrities, the sane majority, can also experience this dread. Walking along a cliff path, we experience the fear of falling and the vertigo of the abyss. But part of this feeling is also due to a curious impulse that seems at the same time both to attract us toward and repel us from the edge. According to Kierkegaard, this comes from our awareness that we could throw ourselves over the edge, the fear of this freedom which lies within our grasp. Here we too experience dread, the madness and terror that lie beneath our normality. By 1844, Kierkegaard had completed The Concept of Dread, as well as a short book called Philosophical Fragments. To this he had added a vast 600-page postscript entitled Concluding Unscientific, and they would cautiously delight in this strange little young old man's impish humour. On weekends, Kierkegaard would hire a coach and ride through the city gardens or into the countryside. He remained mindful of his status as the son of one of the city's richest merchants. But the Olsen family had been outraged at his behaviour toward their daughter Regine, and as a result he had been ostracised by polite society. On Sundays he attended church. Among the other members of the congregation, devoting his life almost entirely to writing. He no longer saw his old student friends, and lived a solitary existence. He emerged only for long walks through the streets of Copenhagen, where his increasingly eccentric appearance attracted attention. A thin, stooped figure in a top hat, he wore narrow trousers with one leg invariably shorter than the other. Always old beyond his years, he already seemed middle-aged. Occasionally he would stop and talk with young children. He would give them small presents. I've seen this may have appeared wrong in the ethical sense, but Kierkegaard saw it as necessary if he was to follow the religious life. It's also not difficult to see dark echoes of his relationship with his father. At the last moment, God had stayed Abraham's hand so that Isaac was not sacrificed. Kierkegaard had been driven to the brink of spiritual extinction by his domineering father, who then died so that his son might turn into something. By the age of 30, Kierkegaard was he would frequently notice Regine, and she would notice him. They didn't speak, but they were well aware of each other. Although he had hurt her deeply, and hurt himself even more, there remained a hidden bond between them. For all his psychological self-probing and honesty, Kierkegaard continued to be curiously prone to delusion. He couldn't stop hoping that someday, somehow, he and Regine would be reunited, presumably in some kind of spiritual bond. Although he knew it was impossible, he couldn't help himself from longing for the impossible. His analysis of their relationship remained a constant preoccupation, and this only contributed to his ever-deepening self-knowledge. He became only too aware of the endless subterfuges that the mind plays upon itself. What had begun as a highly personal fiasco of inadequacy led him to see the universal inadequacies of human nature. Subjectivity itself was impossible, yet it had to be lived. Meanwhile,